absolute pleasure to introduce our guest, Camilla Long, who is a speaker, facilitator, and co-founder of Bespoke Communications, a leading learning consultancy working with company leaders to grow high-performing teams. Camilla is a featured speaker at leading conferences, shaping the future of workforce communication and leadership with her insights and practical strategies. Hopefully we'll see some of those today. Camilla's focus is on communication skills that create connection, increase collaboration, and facilitate brilliant presentation. So we are in extremely good hands. And with that, let's get started. And Camilla, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion. It's so lovely to hear those wonderful words. I mean, they would be twice as amazing if I hadn't written them myself. So Thank you so much for such a warm welcome. And look, it's my pleasure to be with this group, with all of you here today. Marion, I checked my diary and we agreed this date on the 13th of February this year. Can you believe it? It's going back that long. Folks, I'm going to share my screen with you. I've got some slides. I've got some material that I want to share with you. So I'm going to pop that shared screen up. And look, if you have any challenges accessing any of this, do please let me know. So let me try and do that now. And go ahead and share that screen. Now, I'm just having a little bit of problem. See, Marion, when we do our dress rehearsal and it all works fine, that is just not coming up for me. Let me try it again. Yeah, perfect. There we go. Stop sharing. We ran a little dress rehearsal and this all worked fine. So you know how it is. Always different when you get into the live room. Hopefully, folks, you can see that shared content now. Let me know if there's any issues with audio, with anything that you can't see during the session. Marion has already flagged with you that, look, I am very happy to take questions as we go through the session. So do drop your questions into the chat. And I will say to you that I am a communications skills specialist. As I go through the session, if you think I have no idea what she is talking about, please, at that moment, drop your queries, drop your questions into the chat, and I'll be happy to offer any clarification. By way of background, I am a computer scientist by background. I am logical in the way that I think. I have all of that scientist training. So when it comes to communication skills, for me, it's very much learned behavior. And the session that I'm about to run for you today is based on peer-reviewed research, shaped very much around, first of all, my own experiences, but now as a coach for the last decade, having worked with leaders and people in so many different situations, I've tried to pull together what I believe to be some of the opportunities that we all have to help us within the workplace to overcome that imposter syndrome so that we make our voice heard. So to get us started today, I have a short video that I want to play for you. And as you watch this video, I'm wondering, what is the message that you might take away from this video? Ostensibly, I will tell you now, it's a video about chewing gum, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. Have a watch of this.
Welcome. Which one seems like he has more friends? Which one has more imaginary friends? Which one gets invited to more parties? Which one gets invited to more bridge tournaments? Which one is the bad cop? Which of these bosses would give you a raise? Which one would fire you when you ask for a raise? Which one has a better sex life? Which one never puts money into the employee gift pool? Which one really enjoys giving you a ticket? Thank you.
So folks, what are we talking about here? When we look at a video like that, what's the message that we're getting from it? And I think really what we're speaking about here is unconscious bias. And when we talk about unconscious bias, that's the bias that each and every one of us brings into decisions that we make, judgments that we make about the world around us, based on our own prior experience, our own personal thought patterns, assumptions that we make, ways that we interpret the world, without us even being aware that we're doing it. So when it comes to imposter syndrome, it's the imposter syndrome that sometimes we feel in certain situations very often is a product of how we've been socialized. It's a product of feelings that have arisen in situations that are going back, honestly, sometimes, and in my case, we're talking about many decades. So there are times when we find ourselves in situations, and because of unconscious thought patterns, sometimes we behave in those situations in ways that aren't helpful to us at all. So that unconscious bias is something that we can bring into situations that affect how we respond to the situation. But what I'm also talking about in terms of, and this is a session which is geared and positioned towards women in the workplace. There are certain ways in which we are socialized as women in the world that dictate how the world responds to us. And if, for example, I was to even bring up some of the statistics about the impact of gender-based socialization, you can see a couple of children, 2 children playing in the playground here. Within the playground, research shows that boys interrupt girls 2.5 times more frequently than girls interrupt other girls or than girls interrupt other boys. So at the age of 4, that's the sort of socialization that we've been exposed to. So is it any wonder that these thought patterns around imposter syndrome arise within us as grown adults? And what I want to do is at the top of this session, make it absolutely hugely clear that at no point is this workshop saying that you are part of the problem. Absolutely not. What I'm saying is there's an environment here where we can accept that there have been certain thought patterns that have been socialized into us, that we have started to make these assumptions without necessarily even being aware of it. What I want to do in today's session is to simply give you some practical tools, some tactical approaches, a little bit of strategic thinking to help you to make sure that imposter syndrome doesn't get in the way of the opportunities that you want to have in your life. And specifically today, we're talking about workplace environments. So look, I'll introduce you to some strategic frameworks, some tactical approaches that you can take. And at the end of the session, what I will be doing is I'll be coming back to you and I'll be asking you, what's your T? And in this instance, T stands for tiny, empowering action. You're going to give me an hour of your time today. I would really like you to take away just one thing that you can do that you believe will make a difference in your world, make a difference to you in your professional life. And sometimes out of these sessions, people take away ideas that might work in their personal life. So just know that at the end of the session, I'll be asking you to reflect and think about applying the value of this session within your own life. So, how do we start to approach the impact of imposter syndrome in our lives? Well, to do that, I want to introduce you to a framework known as the blue dot model of influence. And when I speak about the blue dot model, most of us and all of us are very familiar with a world where we have become the blue dot at the center of whatever app it is that we're using. So if I was to speak to you about Google Maps today, and if you can visualize yourself moving from A to B, and if you open up your phone and open up your Google Maps, program in your destination, you will realize very quickly that Google Maps makes you a blue dot at the center of your very own universe. So in the old days, I'm sure it's been many years since you've used a paper map. There was a lot of calculations and a lot of work that went into getting from A to B. You had to work out, first of all, where you were on that map. You had to work out where you were originating from. And then as you moved, you had to keep recalibrating your environment. And I know that I'm certainly speaking to a lot of very expert people when it comes to maps. So in terms of the blue dot model of influence, I want you to think of how you can use this framework to make the person that you're speaking with, or the environment within which you find yourself speaking, to make your audience or that person that you're sitting in front of the blue dot at the center of their universe. And this is a little framework that's going to help you how to do that. And ultimately, by doing that, that is a way to take the pressure off you. In other words, to alleviate some of that imposter syndrome that we're feeling, so that we can show up as we want to show up in the world. So there are 3 steps to this. First step is to be centered. Second step is to be curious. And the third step is to be clear. Let me walk through each of those steps for you in turn. So in the first instance, if we're going to talk about being centered, all of us naturally will find ourselves on a spectrum in terms of our default behaviors. All of us will find ourselves on a spectrum where at one end of the spectrum, your natural behavior might be more approachable, or at the other end of the spectrum, you might find yourself relying more on authority to make your point known. Now, for me, I definitely sit on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of approachability being 1 and authority being 10, I'm probably sitting up at about an 8. For me, my default position is to be authoritative in my demeanor. And for me, that default behavior, that's what's got me to where I am today. For each of you, whether you sit, no matter where you sit on that spectrum, that is who you are. That is how you're showing up in the world. And they are the behaviors that have got you to this point. It's just that when we're under situations of pressure, sometimes we default to a position on that approachability authority spectrum that may not necessarily be serving us in that given situation. So the blue dot model is a way of helping you to stand back from the situation for a moment and recognize, what is the behavior that's needed from me in this moment for me to make my voice heard, to quiet that inner voice inside my head, and for me to make my voice heard, for me to make the point that I want to make, for me to create the influence that I want to create with the audience or the people that I have in front of me. So looking first of all to the be centered piece. Well, being centered is about taking that moment to not automatically react in a given situation, but to actually take a moment to step back and give ourselves time and space to take a breath so that we can actually choose how we respond. Rather than automatically reacting, this is about giving ourselves choice. And the 2 ways that you can be centered, the 2 ways that you can buy yourself time to take a pause, take a beat, take a breath. First of all, really powerful technique that you can use is to play back what that person just said. And what I'm talking about here is a summarizing technique. So in the moment, every instinct and every fiber of your being wants to say, no, under no circumstances can I possibly agree with what you're saying. Or perhaps your every instinct is going, that's making me feel a little bit insecure. I'm not quite sure of what my response should be now. In either of those circumstances, taking a pause, taking a beat, taking a breath will certainly, because it gives you a moment to gather your thoughts and choose the appropriate response. And if you, in that moment, take the opportunity to play back the other person's statement, it gives you that chance to gather your thoughts. And by playback, what I mean is you're going to say something like, so what I've heard you say is, or you might say something like, looking at this from your point of view, what I'm seeing is, or you might say something like, from this conversation so far, it seems that, and you make your statement. What's going to happen next? That the other person will take a moment to clarify your thinking, and that buys you really valuable thinking time. Now, that's one unbelievably helpful technique, and 9 times out of 10, that's going to work for you. Sometimes you might find yourself in a little bit more of a heated situation where the energy level is rising in the room. There's a little bit of disagreement going on, and it's really easy at that point to jump in and say something that you regret later. So in this case, the second technique might be helpful for you, and that is the emergency reset. And when we think of an emergency reset, you're saying something like, let me step back for a moment, or help me to understand your thinking. Could you take a moment to explain X, Y, Z? Or I want to understand what it is that you need. Tell me X, Y, Z. Both absolutely brilliant techniques to buy yourself a moment in a meeting. And at that point, you do have the opportunity to take a breath and gather your thoughts. Next step, we're talking about step 1 of our blue dot model is to be centered. The next step, as you'll recall, was to be curious. And let's step into this one. And this really is based on the realization that if you find yourself in a situation where it's a challenging situation, where you really do want to step up and say something that perhaps opposes the other person's point of view, either you're not feeling confident to do that, or you feel like it's too confrontational, or sometimes in the heat of the moment, you just want to jump in and go, no, this is what I think, you are wrong. In any of those situations, it's really important to realize that people persuade themselves. You will never persuade somebody to do something that they don't want to do. So in this case, this is where the second set of questioning techniques comes in helpful. So you'll remember from our being centered situation, what we were doing was buying ourselves time. We were offering the other person the opportunity to speak. With this tool and with this part of the blue dot model, with the being curious part, this is where rather than stepping in with disagreement, you're asking questions to draw out the other person's point of view. And very often you will find that by drawing out their logic, their rationale, their reasons for that decision, very often you'll find themselves almost talking themselves out of it. So some of the sorts of questions that work here, instead of saying to somebody, well, that's never going to work, try, so what would need to be true for that proposal to succeed? Or if somebody's being a little bit inconsistent, instead of saying, well, we already agreed, try what's changed from your earlier train of thought. Or if you really want to disagree with somebody, simply ask the question, I'm really curious about what it is that you're proposing. Or what am I missing when I hear you say? Genuinely, what you're doing is you're approaching that situation from a position of curiosity as opposed to a position of adversity. Sometimes too, when what the other person is saying makes you feel defensive, a helpful approach is focusing on the outcome. So just remind me for a moment, where do we need to get to by the end of this meeting? Or what outcome are we trying to achieve with this project? All of these open questions help to draw out the other person's point of view and give you the opportunity for a constructive conversation as opposed to a combative discussion. This one's also helpful when I'm speaking to a female audience here. I'm not sure how many of you find yourselves in a situation where, for some reason, the office housework seems to be your responsibility. And when I say office housework, we have just as much office housework in a virtual world as we do in a physical office. Physical housework is you're the person who goes around and gets everybody to sign the birthday card. You're the person who gets assigned the fabulous responsibility every single year of organising the Christmas party or signing for the post. That's physical office housework. The virtual version of that is being the person who is asked to take the notes for the meeting, being the person who's asked to merge the slide decks ahead of every meeting, being the person who's asked to round everybody up to attend a meeting. Very often we find that due to that maybe unconscious bias, those tasks fall to the women in the group. That's a little bit of the blue dot model applies just as much here, and it's about taking a beat so that you don't respond in a defensive way. And unfortunately, due to that unconscious bias and socialization issue, any of these responses absolutely demand that you do them with a smile. It's absolutely the case that the research shows that when women behave in an assertive way, sometimes they are viewed, we are viewed as being shrill or bossy or some other adjectives that perhaps aren't so helpful. Whereas when men do the exact same thing, it is seen as showing leadership. So that's where the approachability piece comes in, and the smile needs to go on the face. But if you are the person who is permanently and always asked to do the office housework, what about flipping that on its head and suggesting, well, I merged the slide decks the last time, really happy to do it, but I think if you look back, I've done it the last 3 meetings. Who else might be available to take on that task? Or I'll load the dishwasher this week, merge the slide decks this week, take the notes this week. Let's set up a rotation so that everybody can take it in turns. Or what makes you think I'm a good fit for this opportunity? Or you might just go back and remind the person that, look, on this occasion, that's just not something I can take on. I really do need to be focused on this project. Beaming smile, just to remind them. Marion, before I move on to the next section, I'm wondering if there's any comments, questions that have come in on the chat.
Nothing has come in yet, Camilla. But I mean, I think even just from my own observation there really is the key to that is how can you influence the outcome of whether it's a meeting or an interaction without becoming the one who shuts it down by maybe creating some conflict. So I think it's something that you can really bring to any table. I think it's great advice.
Yeah, I think you're right, Marion. And often we find ourselves defaulting to that position because of this sometimes defensiveness that arises due to the insecurity we're feeling in the setting. We feel the absolute need to make our point, and we do need to make our point, but sometimes it just doesn't come out the way that we want it to. I recall a situation where I was working with a young woman who was a member of a global sales team, and there were about 18 or 20 people on the team. 2 women under the age of 30, everybody else was over that age, recently married. One of the women had a young baby at home, and they discovered that 16 people were invited to the annual sales meeting in Paris, and their 2 names weren't on the list. And this is a little reminder too that people don't always do things with negative intentions in mind. Very often it's an unconscious bias that's kicking in. And so both of them went to their manager and said, hi, we'd really like to go to Paris. And their manager literally looked at them with his jaw on the floor because he hadn't even given any consideration to the fact that they might want to go. He had completely made the assumption that because they were at that stages of their family development, that they just wouldn't be interested. And he looked at them, and in that moment, he completely apologized to them and said, this is completely my bad. I just completely made an assumption. Of course, you're going to be on the agenda for the Paris meeting. And this was a manager that they had a very good relationship with. So sometimes, you know, we sit and stew over our imposter syndrome, and actually by being open and honest about what it is that we need and what it is that we feel, we can end up in a very constructive conversation. That manager only did that once. He didn't need to be reminded of that a second time. Great. Well, I will move on to the final part of what it was that I wanted to look at today. And it's the final part of our blue dot model, where I'm asking you to be clear in your communication style. And we're going to talk about a few different opportunities that we have to address that. So the first one is language hacks, how we can signal authority and intent with the language that we use. The second thing is the body language tells. There are times when we want to say something and our body language says something completely different. And the third one is one that some of you in the room may be familiar with. When you get talked over in a meeting, how do you overcome that situation? So tool number one, the language hacks. And here I'm going to flag up some red language characteristics or red language features that sometimes we use. Again, because of that unconscious bias, we're not even aware that we're using them. And how can we shift from red to green language, where green language signals confidence, comfort, and control of a situation? So the first one we will look at, and regardless of what language you speak, what your native language is, there will be a version of the word basically. It might come up in the form of the word like, or you know, or so. What are we talking about here? We're talking about those filler words that we use in our presentation, in our speech, that very often can get in the way of us making our point with confidence. So when we use filler words, what's actually going on in that moment? A filler word is essentially a discomfort that we all feel with silence. Where actually, if we were to use silence, it imbues everything that we're saying with a whole extra layer of authority. Silence, taking the opportunity to take a pause, is an opportunity for us to be centered because we're gathering our thoughts. It absolutely, and then jumps to this third part of our blue dot model, where it gives us the opportunity to be clearer in our communication. Let me be perfectly clear on this point, however. Filler words absolutely signify that you're a human being. If you're to look at AI voiceovers, you will never hear a filler word, and nobody wants to be speaking to a robot. Nobody wants to be speaking to somebody who's absolutely perfect top to bottom. A filler word here or there is simply you being a human being. What I'm talking about here is when we rely on filler words to the extent that they pepper our conversation. That starts to become a tell that perhaps you're not speaking from a place of confidence. So what is it that we can do instead of using filler words? Well, the first thing is that we become very aware of our pace. If we have a tendency, and if you're feeling, if the imposter syndrome, if that voice is inside your head, chitter-chattering away to you, that sometimes can be a little unconscious bias signal to us to race off at 100 miles an hour, very much like the hair that you can see on the screen in front of you. And whilst I'm not suggesting that you turn into a tortoise, because if you start to speak laboriously slowly, you're going to lose your audience completely. Nobody wants to stick around and listen to somebody who's speaking at a pace of 1 word per second. What we're talking about here really is having an awareness of where the full stops are in your sentence, where the commas are in your sentence, and learning to use them. Just like I'm doing right now, in a very exaggerated way, because that will help you to gather your thoughts, and it helps to give your words authority. If anybody wants to come in with any observations on that, I'll be very glad to speak to that point. I'm going to move on to the next language pattern that can unwittingly leech away at your authority. And it's the word sorry. Now, just like filler words, I'm not suggesting that if you have been delayed in sending information over, or if you have made a mistake, or if there is some situation within which you find yourself that you completely ignore the opportunity to take accountability for it. That's not what I'm speaking about here. What I'm speaking about here is the unintentional overuse of the word sorry. And we can find ourselves even in emails. Oh, so sorry, I'm sending this over late. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I forgot to get that to you. Sorry. I know I'd said I'd get this to you by Friday and it's now Monday morning. These are all situations where I think stepping up and taking ownership and accountability is a very attractive characteristic, but we don't need to over apologize. What about instead of sorry, I'm sending this late? Thank you for your patience. And if that's you, if you are a serial apologizer, again, the antidote to that is go back to our blue dot model, be centered, find an opportunity for a pause, and make a choice about the language that you use. Oh, so sorry. I've been whittering on. I've been talking far too much. How about thanks for listening instead of that? Another version of this is the word just. Sometimes we use that word just to diminish the impact of what it is that we're saying. And really what we're trying to do when we use the word just is veer towards the approachability end of the spectrum. We don't want to seem like we're being bossy or overbearing. Oh, I just wanted to check in on that report that was due last Friday. We can do away with language like that, and we can simply ask for an update on the report. Two of those characteristics. The final one is we're in the middle of explaining something and we pause and we're asking, does that make sense? Now, there are two situations where this phrase gets used and where there are possibly better opportunities or better phrases that we could use in their stead. The first is where we're asking, does that make sense? In a way that implies, I'm not even sure if what I said made sense to myself. So I'm taking the opportunity to check in with you. And the second one is simply where we're asking, I've presented a complex piece of information and I'm asking you, does that make sense to you? Let's address the first one. If you're in the habit of using, does that make sense as a validation mechanism, we're going to find something better for you to say in place of that. So instead of, does that make sense? How about asking your audience if they have any questions? Or how about checking in with your audience with something like, it's been a complicated piece of information that I've just shared with you. Most people have questions. If you have one, I'd love to hear it now. Asking them to come back to you with questions. Now, that's the first situation where we're using, does that make sense, as a way of validating our own delivery. The second situation where we use, does that make sense, is very often when we have presented something complicated and we might be presenting it to an audience that perhaps feel a little bit less confident in their own abilities. And although they have questions, they're not going to want to ask them because they feel like, well, I might look stupid in front of everybody else. So in that situation, instead of asking, does that make sense, where the likelihood of you getting a response is very, very low, in that situation, what you might choose to do instead is to suggest to them that I'm now open for your questions. This is a complex piece of information that I've just presented. Most people have questions. I'd love to know how you would see that working in your environment. I'm here to help you to do that. So almost giving them permission to ask a question. Because for most of us, when we ask, does that make sense? We don't tend to get a whole lot of questions back. We don't tend to get a whole lot of response back to that. So there are better ways to ask, does that make sense? And if you're sending an email, well, I look forward to your feedback is a great way to respond to that. So again, Marion, I'll check in with you. Anything before I move on to talk about our second tool, which is our body language and the presence that we bring to our presentations or to our meetings? I will take it that silence indicates, oh, there's something coming in there, is there? Shall I check the chat?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there.
Oh, no worries, no
Camilla.
worries. Do you want to call that back to me?
Yeah, just from Karen there, there's Karen Cahill, there's a quick question in there. For somebody new to these techniques, what is the quick win that they can practice? So out of all of I know that you have the framework there, but is there anything particular that you can just switch on?
It's a great question, Karen. And look, I will say to all of you, please do, after this session, if there's a lot of information here that is new to you, connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a little cheat sheet that covers a lot of these phrases, these turns of these questions that you can ask. I'm very happy to share that with you. But to go back to Karen, and in the moment, I would say start to think about that blue dot model ahead of time for your meeting. So start to think about, rather than being reactive to perhaps sometimes that feeling that exists in our tummy of, oh, I'm not so sure, that will automatically put you into a defensive situation. That imposter syndrome is a little voice in our head that chats to us. And unfortunately, in moments of stress or in evaluative situations or under moments of pressure, it sometimes causes us to default to behaviors that don't serve us at all. So buying time is probably the key part of the blue dot model in answer to your question, Karen. So I would suggest that playback technique is probably the most powerful thing that you have in your arsenal to get you started on all of this. So literally get in the habit of not just reacting to questions, but instead using that playback technique. So what I'm hearing you say is, or from what I'm seeing in this conversation, it looks like, or from what I've heard, it seems like. So using something like it looks like, it seems like, it feels like, that will buy you the time to gather your thoughts, take a deep breath, and show up the way that you want to show up. So thank you so much, Karen, for coming in with that question.
Another couple there, Camilla. So from Jenny Hannafin, how do you strike a balance between being authoritative in tone, but welcoming input from people, especially those who may be intimidated by authority?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jennifer. And look, like I said, speaking personally, all of my life, because of the imposter syndrome, truthfully, because of the little insecurity that sits in my tummy sometimes in stressful situations, my choice or my default coping mechanism is to show up as super authoritative. So like everything I've got to say here, I'm so competent, I'm so capable. That's kind of like the cloak that I've wrapped myself in all my life. For some of you, your cloak might well be being super approachable, being super helpful, being super kind. We are all different. I can speak personally about what my cloak looks like. Each one of you will have a different cloak that you use to cope with stressful situations. What we're talking about here is an acknowledging that whatever that cloak is, it's absolutely served you. It's who you are. It's how you've shown up. It's gotten you to this point in time. It's just as we start to progress through our careers, the different situations that we find ourselves in sometimes demand that we don't react by default. And so that authoritativeness will show up in how prepared you are for the event and how well covered you are with the information that you've gathered and the research that you've done into the audience and their needs. But the approachability piece, that's really about creating psychological safety in the room for folks who may not necessarily have the confidence that you do at this point in your career. So it is absolutely stopping, inviting input, sharing perhaps anecdotes of where maybe you didn't always get it right and the learnings that you've taken from those situations. So if, like me, you're on the authoritative side, sometimes leaning into a little bit of that vulnerability as a leader or as a peer will absolutely help you. Sharing moments that just weren't always perfect, the projects that didn't go well and how you recovered from them might well be a tool that you can use. And look, that's something that certainly I speak to in leadership executives presence programs that we run for different companies. There are cultural attunements that we can look at there. But I would suggest that if your default is either approachability, there will be a little piece around those language hacks that I've just shared with you that I would suggest you lean into and that you learn. If, like me, you're the authoritative person, I would get comfortable with being uncomfortable and start to learn to be a little bit vulnerable in situations and share a little bit of yourself. Let them in just a little bit. Jennifer, I hope that helps in response to your question in this moment. Marion, anything else, or shall I? Oh, go ahead.
One more. How do you deal with others who interrupt you unfairly?
Yeah, we're going to get to that. I've got a little piece. That is a question that I will get asked every single time on a session like this. So I have a couple of minutes at the end of the session where I'm going to cover that.
Sure. Perfect.
Because they do. And most of the time, it's unconscious bias. They're not even aware that they're doing it. So there's certainly an element too of the approachability has to come in here, because we're not going to cut people off back in return. We're going to find ways to be very stylish about how we do that. It's a fabulous question. So before I get to that bit about the interruptions, I'd like to talk a little bit about our body language and how that helps us to show up either with approachability or with authority or a mixture of the two. So we're going to look at our body language. And what I will say to you is, if you are walking into a meeting that matters, and this might be your daily huddle, it might be with people that you literally see every single day. It might be with senior leadership who you get very little exposure to. It might be with a very important client. If this is a meeting that matters, it absolutely behoves you to ground yourself, to center yourself before you get into the meeting. And, you know, on days where you feel like you're on back-to-back Teams calls, where it feels like the meetings never end, it's about literally taking whatever time you can between those meetings to check in with yourself instead of rushing to get that email out the door before you dart into the meeting 2 minutes late. A lot of that is self-imposed pressure. So what I'm speaking about here are mindfulness techniques, really. And I'm not sure for all of you, some of you will have greater familiarity with mindfulness than others, but if it's a new idea to you, there are great apps that you can check into that help you to understand what mindfulness is and how it can help you both in your personal and your professional lives. I've popped 2 examples up on the screen in front of you. Headspace is how I got started on my mindfulness journey about a decade ago. I've dipped in and out of the Calm app, which is the one that's underneath. They may well be apps that are known to some of you in larger organizations. I know that your organization quite likely has a subscription to an app like this, because it's widely acknowledged that mindfulness is a helpful tool for everybody in the workplace. But there are some small micro examples of, or micro instances of mindfulness that we can bring into our daily practice that will help us without even needing to engage with an app. And that is being mindful and intentional about just creating a little bit of space to ground your energy in between meetings. Because we all know as the day progresses, your shoulders might start off here. And by the end of the day, half the time with the stress and the rushing around, your shoulders are right up at your ears and your jaw's clenched and you've got a furrowed brow. And that's just a body language indication to you that the day is stressful. If you are showing up to your next meeting with your shoulders already halfway up to your ears, you're not going to be at your best. So it's about grounding that energy. And I would suggest that there are 60-second meditations online that you can click into where you just take a moment to relax and pause. For me, I will a few times a week, definitely do that. I don't always do it because, you have to go Google them, you have to go search them. The thing that all of us can do, the thing that all of us have available to us, whether we have access to apps or not, each and every one of us have access to our breath. And so a little bit of breath work in between meetings can just help to center that energy, to ground that energy, so that you can show up with that smile on your face, with that authoritative tone of voice in a way that absolutely diminishes the impact that imposter syndrome voice has on us. So very quickly, I will show you a basic breathing technique that I promise you will serve you in your most stressful situations, in situations where you're rushing to, make childcare before they close and your children are going to be signed up to social services, when you're trying to dash from one side of town to another to a client meeting and every single light is red. When you just feel like life is stressful, this breathing technique will absolutely help you. And you can do it in your car when you're at the lights. You can do it when you're at your desk, when the little wheel is spinning and you're about to go into your next Teams meeting. And I promise you, it's going to help to make your day better. So it's called box breathing. And what it involves is, it's called box breathing because it's got 4 parts to it. So if you imagine 4 parts of a box, and what it involves is taking a deep breath in for 4 seconds, holding that breath for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4 seconds, and holding for 4 seconds. Folks, in total, it's a 16-second intervention into your day, and I promise you it's going to make your day better. So let's just do a quick box breathing technique here together whilst we're on this call so that you can get a feel for it. So I'll talk you through it. So first of all, I'm going to ask you to just take a look at your posture, make sure that you're not slouched or you're not sitting with one hand under your face, or, just get a nice upright position. Not that you've got to poke up your back, nice and relaxed, but just do a quick body scan, check in, make sure that your shoulders aren't halfway up to your ear. Make sure that you haven't got a clenched jaw. Just have a little bit of a muscle release from top to toe, checking in with your eyes kind of furrowed and stressed. Have you got a relaxed expression there? Relaxed expression around your face. Where are your shoulders at? Where are your hands? Nice and relaxed, either on the desk in front of you or on your lap. Just get into a nice relaxed position there. And then take a deep breath in. And when you take that deep breath in, just make sure that breath is traveling all the way down into your tummy, past your chest, and all the way down into your tummy. If you were to visualize your tummy as being like a beach ball, it would be like somebody's blowing that beach ball up. Your tummy should blow up like a beach ball. And so that's a nice deep breath. And then with that nice deep breath all the way down into your tummy, I'm going to count you in and out now. So we're going to take that deep breath in for 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2, 3, 4. Out 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2, 3, 4. Straight away, the world is a better place, regardless of what news headline you've just heard, regardless of what's going on in your life. So take a moment between meetings, especially if it's an important one, to just ground yourself before you step into the meeting. The next body language piece that we look at, and regardless of whether you want to be authoritative or approachable, that smile is so very important, because there's a facial feedback hypothesis that when we smile, even if it's a fake smile, we're sending endorphins, the happy hormone, around our body. There's a psychological test that's done quite frequently called the smile pencil test, which involves asking participants to take a pencil. I've got a pen in my hand. To take a pencil, put it between their teeth so that it forces the corners of their mouth up. And when they're plugged into fMRI machines, that hormone starts to flow more freely, even though they're not smiling because they're happy. They are simply putting the corners of their mouth up. So it is absolutely scientifically proven that a smile puts you in a better mood, and you can't have 2 emotions existing at once. The anxiety cannot coexist with happiness. So by flooding your body with some form of happiness, you are automatically damping down the impact of that imposter syndrome on you. And there's a feedback hypothesis that goes that by smiling, we're introducing the happy hormones. And when we introduce the happy hormones, what happens? We want to smile. So regardless of the situation that you're finding yourself in, my personal trainer says to me, smile, it makes it go quicker. And she's right. When you're there doing your plank and that 60 seconds feels like it's a really long time, if you smile, it takes less time, I promise you. So that smile is absolutely going to be an important thing. And you know what? It's not something that we all think about very often. And especially if you're like me, where perhaps the anxiety is sitting there, very often when we're feeling anxious, the last thing we want to do is smile. But that facial feedback hypothesis tells us that that smile is a really powerful antidote to that imposter syndrome in the moment. It helps you to show up the way that you want. And there might be times, of course, where a big Cheshire cat smile is not the most appropriate thing to do, in which case we're going to do the Botox face. We're going to have an open face. And I'm not saying that Michelle Hussein that we see on the screen in front of us here has Botox injected into her forehead, but she definitely has an open face. So get those eyebrows up and look curious. Get that expression of curiosity onto your face. The next image that I have here is of Angela Merkel, who is no longer in power. But there's a piece here around what do we do with our hands? And if you spend a lot of time on virtual meetings, here's what I know you do with your hands. And almost guaranteed, and if you start to observe this in meetings, if somebody turns to somebody else in a large meeting and asks them a question, they're not feeling secure about the answer. This is the body language tell that happens. They're sitting there, Camilla, what do you think about this? And I'm thinking, what? I wasn't even listening. What did they just ask me? My natural reflex will be to put my hand up to my face. So making sure that the hands are nice and relaxed on the desk signals that you're interested in the meeting. It also reduces the risk of that body language tell getting in the way of your authority. Leaning in, there's a whole book by Sheryl Sandberg called Lean In and the importance of our physical presence at the table. And that counts for our virtual meetings just as much as it does for our physical ones. So look, in the final minutes of the session, I want to get to that all-important point about crushing interruptions. And this, it's very important that the body language around this one is quietly confident and assertive. So this absolutely speaks to that piece that I've just spoken to about body language. It's very important that when that interruption comes, that the body language and the smile comes across our face, because if the smile isn't on our face, suddenly that gender bias kicks in, that unconscious bias kicks in, and suddenly we're not projecting what it is that we want to project. So these phrases are phrases that you're going to use with a smile on your face. So if somebody interrupts you, Sarah, I'm going to finish my point. This matters because the project deadline is Friday and I want to make sure that this particular feature is taken care of. So understand why what you're saying is important, and very comfortably, when somebody butts in, you can intercept with the reason why people need to sit in the room and listen to what you're saying. That's the most basic one. And here's the thing, the first time somebody interrupts you, certainly the first time somebody interrupts me, I'm literally sitting there like a goldfish with my jaw on the floor, like, I can't believe they were so rude. This is probably something that you'll do the second time they interrupt you, because you'll have had time to gather your thoughts and be prepared. The second one, and this one works absolutely beautifully. Mike, I'll be really glad to get your feedback after I've shared my points. But I'm really keen to make sure that you hear what I've got to say first. Smile, smile. And what you're doing with these two statements is you're signaling that what you've got to say is important and that you're not going to be willingly interrupted. And very often, folks, when people implement one or other of those phrases, what you start to notice is that the serial interrupter pipes down their own behavior, because very often they're interrupting without even realizing that they're doing it. And the final point on interruption, and it comes from Sheryl Sandberg, whose book I've just referenced already, former COO of Facebook, Meta. There's a piece too about looking out for one another. So if you notice that Sarah is constantly interrupted, there might be a role for you to play here in interjecting on Sarah's behalf and to ask the meeting to say, oh, wait a minute, Sarah was just in the middle of something that I think is important because Sarah, and give the mic back to her. Because the more women help one another, the more we help ourselves. Acting like a coalition truly does produce results. And the final point I will make on meeting interruptions is, if there is a serial interrupter, what about getting them offline and using the I feel technique? Because when you use the word I feel, nobody can interrupt with that. Nobody can dispute that. When you use the word I feel, that's your truth. It's no one else's truth. So look, Sarah, when you interrupt me in the meeting, I feel like my point of view is being diminished. And so it's really important to interrupt with the general I feel statement and to come back with specific examples. So in last week's meeting, when we were discussing Project XYZ, and I was talking about whatever it was, and you interrupted, I felt like I'd put a lot of hard work into that, and I just didn't get a chance to show people the results that I'd achieved. You might find that if you have a quiet word offline with an I feel statement, that you're making somebody aware of some behavior that they're not even aware of. Folks, we're on 60 seconds to go. Marion, I promised I'd hand the microphone back to you. I've talked to you about this way of thinking, which is being centered, being curious, being clear. And I did promise I would ask you at the end, what's your T? And if it's helpful for you, I have a QR code up on the screen. It's a feedback gathering mechanism for me. I would love to know what you took away from this session. There are questions in there that absolutely will help me to understand the value that I've added to you. So very much around me learning. There are questions there that ask you what you're going to do differently as a result of coming today. You will be emailed a copy of your response. If you provide your email address, it will be used for no other purposes, and you might find that a helpful accountability mechanism. Thank you so much for giving me your time today. Marion, I'll hand the microphone back to you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Camilla. We still have a few questions, and I'm just wondering, anybody who still had some questions, maybe you can connect with Camilla on LinkedIn, and I'm sure she'll give you some great advice there as well. So again, thank you very much, Camilla, for sharing your insights today. I mean, it's been definitely very good feedback on it so far, and I think everybody will have taken something positive out of it.